Madam Anupriya Patel, Ms. Preeti Sudan, Health Secretary, Professor Ashutosh Sharma, Secretary DST, the Executive Directors of the TBVI and the Stop TB Partnership, Regional Director of CRO, Dr. Poonam Khetrapal Singh, and dear Mona. I think it was really good to hear Mona's story, because very often we get caught up in millions and we talk about 1.7 million people dying, but then you hear the story of one person and you know what that one person means, to his or her family. So I think we constantly need to be reminded, and I've seen this happen in AIDS conferences very effectively, when a lot of survivors and people living with the disease, and I've seen people speak in the early days of the AIDS epidemic, and by the time the next conference came around next year, they were no longer alive, because this was pre-ART. And I remember a little South African boy who became such an activist, and this was when the time when the South African government was refusing to roll out treatment for ART. And next year when the conference came, we heard that he had passed away. So this is a disease that I think when you're touched by it, then of course you can never forget it. But even as doctors and physicians, we remember many patients who have suffered from TB. Of course, many of them live, but then some of them don't survive, especially if they have comorbidities like HIV or other serious diseases, or malnutrition. So for India, the biggest problem is malnutrition, and many studies have shown that survival is directly linked to body weight. So if you start off with a body weight of under 35 kilograms, which is not so unusual in many parts of India, you then have a 4 times higher risk of dying from TB. And that is why the Indian government's initiative now to give a support, a financial incentive to every TB patient is a wonderful initiative, because those extra 500 rupees or 1,000 rupees some states are giving additional amount will help them to buy food, because obviously they can't go to work during the period when they're sick. So today when we're all TB, most of us in this room, I guess, are experts. So I think Luchika's right, that we end up talking to ourselves. We're all convinced about the need for TB R&D, and I don't think we need to convince each other anymore. But the message from this conference obviously should be a clear one, and I think this morning's discussions were quite interesting, particularly some of the questions that were asked after the talks about the need for a vaccine, how long it will take, and the kind of investment that might need to go into it. I think that we have to recognize that BCG, even though it's about 100 years old, has protected millions of children in the last century from getting TB, and it has served us well. Until we get a better replacement vaccine, we need to continue to use BCG, but we also recognize the limitations and why we need to improve on that. But we also should know that TB, the Mycobacterium TB organism, is a very hardy one. It's been around with humankind for over 10,000 years. It knows how to adapt itself and live in a latent form, in a dormant form, to get reactivated. So it's actually a big scientific challenge for all of us to really understand the life cycle of the bug, and at what points you can intervene actually to prevent transmission or to reduce the effect of the disease. And in the last 10 to 15 years, we have seen major advances in understanding the fundamental biology of M. tuberculosis, right from the genomic studies which have described whole genome sequences from different parts of the world. We're understanding much more about the antigens and epitopes which induce protective immunity, though the understanding is still incomplete, but we are certainly much better off than we were. We understand better the transmission dynamics of drug-sensitive and drug-resistant TB, the epidemiology, and also how drugs are acting at the molecular level. And therefore, we've seen an increase in the number of molecules that are coming in for testing. But we know that it's a long way from identifying a drug target and an enzyme that could be targeted to actually having a product that can go into a patient's mouth. It's a long journey. It needs teams and teams of people to be working consistently. It needs a lot of resources, and it needs different kinds of expertise to come together to take it from the chemistry, organic chemistry part, to the developing it into a druggable molecule, and then doing the animal studies, the preclinical studies, and then taking it through so many stages of human clinical testing. And the same is true for a vaccine. So one has to be very patient in this field, and I don't know if Dr. Kaufman is here in the audience, but he's probably one of the few people who in his lifetime can have the satisfaction of seeing his vaccine candidate progress to the point where it's being now manufactured in India and has gone into multiple phase 3 trials. Now, Dr. Poonam mentioned the political developments over the last 2 years, and the number of declarations that have been made, the number of commitments at the G20, at the World Health Assembly, at the UN General Assembly, at the Moscow Ministerial Conference, at the BRICS conference here in New Delhi. And this bodes well because it shows a commitment at the highest level from health ministers and heads of government, something which has never happened before for TB. So I think there's a lot to be very satisfied about. But I think we have to turn this rhetoric into action. And that is the job of all of us. Once the politicians commit, somebody has to turn that commitment into action, whether it's at the level of the ministries of health that have to develop and roll out the programs, or whether it's the science agencies which need to step up their investment into TB R&D. So I think that's the stage where we are now. And certainly India has shown not only the political commitment, but also at the operational level by setting up the India TB Research Consortium that brings together a network of partners. And one of the things we are very keen to do is to engage with industry, because I think the pharma company, the vaccine manufacturing companies, certainly in India, if you look at global vaccine, at the supply of global vaccines, about, I think, 60% or so comes, and certainly for the Gavi vaccines, I think 80% of the vaccines actually are manufactured and supplied from India. So India is a huge global manufacturing hub for vaccines. And not only are these vaccines more affordable, but they are also now innovating into new models of delivery. So I think we've got to look at, in the vaccine field, innovatively, as Luchika was saying, look at areas beyond what we've done in the past, look at new delivery methods. We need to develop immunity within the lungs, because most often TB begins in the lungs. And so we need to think of strategies to deliver vaccines differently. We need to work on antigens that need to be combined in vaccines. And we need to think about new testing models like the human challenge model that Eric Rubin described this morning, in order to speed up the process of vaccine development. And as I said before, you need teams of people who can do clinical trials, you need the field sites, you need communities and patient groups to be involved. You need, of course, the basic scientists, the chemists, the pharmacologists, and so on. And therefore, there's a role to play for everybody, but there needs to be a sustained funding behind all of this, because very often we see there's some promising developments and then nothing happens for the next few years because those agencies are struggling to find funds to advance the candidate. And I think in the vaccine field, we've seen this happen repeatedly. It's taken a long time to test some of these vaccines. Of course, if you test 10, 9 of them may fail. And that's the reason why we have to go on, and we shouldn't stop just because we've had unsuccessful vaccine trials in the past. But very often the funders are reluctant to put more and more funding into something they're not convinced is going to go. So finally, I want to end by saying that the WHO, with its new strategic framework for 5 years, what we call the General Program of Work 13, has a very ambitious target, what we call the 3 billion target. And the DG of WHO, Dr. Tedros, hopefully will be visiting India next month for a number of events around TB and the Stop TB Partnership board meetings. Yes, I'll finish now. I'll finish with, that was a very dramatic reminder. But the 3 billion targets are to provide 1 billion more people with universal health coverage, 1 billion more people made safer, and 1 billion more people to live healthier lives. And I think a TB vaccine would actually fulfill each of those three priorities. So thank you very much for this opportunity. Good night.